Welcome to Chapter 10 of Intro to Psychology. In this video, I'll be talking about motivation. When we say motivation, we're talking about a very specific construct. We're talking about the wants or needs or desires that direct a person towards a particular goal. And we usually talk about motivation in two sides, intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. So when we say intrinsic motivation, we're talking about behaviors that we engage in because there's some kind of personal reward, some kind of naturally satisfying element of that activity that we desire to partake in. Whereas in extrinsic motivation, there's some kind of external factor that is driving us to perform that particular behavior, such as money or getting praise from other people, some external element that is influencing our inner desires. So intrinsic is internal and extrinsic is external. Another example could be performance in school. So there's some people who decide to enroll in a class just because they find that material naturally interesting. And they're not really that concerned about the grades. They're just concerned about learning the material because they find it naturally exciting or interesting. Whereas someone who experiences extrinsic motivation would be someone who enrolls in a class and says, I need to get a good grade, or I need to take this class so that I can learn something that will enable me to make money. There's a particular external factor that is motivating them to engage in the behavior of enrolling in a class. And for most people who are enrolled in any kind of class, both of those elements are present. There's some intrinsic motivation and there's some extrinsic motivation as well. Another example could be running a race. So you could be someone like Usain Bolt, who is running to win a gold medal. There's some important external reward at the end that is motivating him to train and to run and to participate in the Olympics. Or you could be someone like Forrest Gump, who just runs for the sake of running. There's no particular reward attached to it that's motivating his desire to participate in that activity. He just does it because it's naturally interesting to him. So usually when we think about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, sometimes we tend to think of them as just two opposite poles, but it might be more accurate to think of them as two sides on a spectrum of motivation. And we see that in particular when we talk about the overjustification effect, which is something that modulates or regulates the relationship between intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. So for example, we often find that when something that we naturally love to do, like icing cakes or baking cakes, becomes something that we are paid to do, becomes our job, such as in this example, like working in a bakery and getting paid to ice those cakes, what we find is that extrinsic motivation tends to increase and intrinsic motivation tends to decrease. So that things that we naturally love doing, when we start receiving a lot of external rewards for doing it, our natural love for doing that activity or that behavior starts to decrease over time. There's some research that suggests the opposite finding, that certain types of reinforcement, such as praise, verbal praise or admiration from others, can actually increase intrinsic motivation. So it's not clear cut. Not everything that you find naturally interesting will become less interesting if you're paid for it. And two explanations to explain those relationships are the type of reinforcement and the expectation of extrinsic reward. So we often find that tangible rewards, such as money, appear to decrease intrinsic motivation fairly significantly. Whereas intangible rewards, such as verbal praise, admiration, a good regard from other people that you're working with, tend to increase motivation. So external factors are important, but they don't always have the same effect on intrinsic motivation. And then there's also expectation. So when you expect and have there's a good pattern and you have a strong expectation that you're going to be rewarded for something that you naturally enjoy doing, that expectation is also shown to decrease intrinsic motivation. Now we'll go over some basic theories of motivation that expand on what we've discussed. Probably one of the earliest theories of motivation was William James's instinct theory of motivation. Once again, William James is largely regarded as the father of American psychology. He was a functionalist. He was interested in how our psychological processes help us function in society or help us adapt to our environments, very much based in the evolutionary theories of Charles Darwin. Uh, and so he proposed that behavior is largely driven by instincts that aid survival. So natural instincts and drives that help us survive and adapt to our environments. So instincts like a mother's protection of her baby, for example, if he were to ask the question, why are people motivated to help their babies? It's because of a natural drive or instinct to protect our genetic lines or our offspring, and that every form of motivation or every behavior that we do essentially comes down to those natural instincts of wanting to protect ourselves and promote adaptation and survival. But his theories were criticized for ignoring the role of learning and shaping in behavior. What we often talk about when we talk about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation has a lot to do with what we learned about in the chapter on learning. Many of the external rewards that people get can be thought of as forms of reinforcement or punishment. And that those aspects of learning help us as we grow and get older, help us develop certain patterns of motivation. Another important theory of motivation is the Yerkes-Dodson law, which is talking about the optimal level for task performance. And what is proposed here is that the optimal level for doing any task has to correspond with a certain level of arousal. And typically, for most tasks, that level of arousal is towards the middle on a spectrum. That when you want to do any kind of task, it's good to not be too stressed, and it's also good not to be experience so little stress that you're not motivated to do that behavior, but that there's some optimal level in the middle, an optimal amount of stress that will help you accomplish that task. And it also states that that optimal level of arousal or stress, we could say, is different depending on the complexity of that task. So for example, if you're doing a simple task like reading a textbook for a class, you are more likely to retain more information from what you're reading if you know you have a test coming up. So if you have a little stress or a little anxiety or just a little bit of pressure on you, you'll remember more than if there's no deadline whatsoever. So if you're reading a textbook and the exam is tomorrow and this is your first time reading the textbook, then you're probably not going to retain that much because it's too high of a stressful situation. Whereas if you're reading a textbook and there's no deadline, you're probably not going to retain that much either because there's not that expectation either. So there's some middle point, a middle level of optimal performance or of optimal arousal to help you do that task. Conversely, that's for a simple task, reading a textbook. Conversely, for a difficult task, like let's say performing brain surgery, you don't want additional pressure. The optimal level of arousal is lower than it would be just for reading a textbook for an exam, because more complex tasks are more optimally performed at a lower level of stress or a lower level of arousal. Another prominent theory of motivation is Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. A very, very, very popular theory in psychology as well as outside of psychology. And Maslow proposed a theory of motivation that spans the spectrum from biological needs to individual needs to social needs, and kind of a hierarchy leading up to self-actualization, a state of inner fulfillment, a state of just a surreal experience where all of a person's needs are met. And he theorized that only a subset of the population ever reaches that self-actualization stage. And the basic building blocks of this theory is that one must satisfy the lower level needs before addressing the needs in the higher levels. So people who do not have food, water, or shelter won't be able to accomplish the needs of experiencing good relationships with their family or friends, or having a good sense of self-worth or accomplishment and confidence. And this is a very popular theory because it makes so much sense. It's just so simple to the eyes, and seems so applicable and seems so straightforward. And it's still a very, very good idea. However, it's not very substantiated by research evidence. It makes a lot of sense just to the on the surface level, but it's not something that is thoroughly supported by research, and saying that the demarcations between these levels are necessarily rigid or strict or well-defined boundaries. Uh, Another problem with Maslow's hierarchy of needs is that it's not very generalizable. He studied the healthiest 1% of the population, and really focused on individuals who he thought had the potential or had reached self-actualization, but did not study people who we would like this theory to apply to, such as people with mental illnesses, or people who have various other kinds of needs or difficulties, or people who have experienced oppression, either interpersonally or on a systems level. And so his theory is not very generalizable to the wider population. A theory that has largely replaced or a modern interpretation of these kinds of theories about motivation is the self-determination theory by Deci and Ryan from their original publication in 2000. And they propose that there are three innate psychological needs that sustain intrinsic motivation. So these are three elements that are needed in order for someone to experience a good level of intrinsic motivation. And those are competence, relatedness, and autonomy. Autonomy, very simply, feeling a sense of self-direction or self-endorsement when performing certain tasks, that you feel like you are independent in what you are doing. And then competence, feeling confident about your ability to perform those tasks. And then relatedness, having a sense of security and companionship with those you interact with or work with. So to give a concrete example, let's say you are the CEO of a software company. You have a marketing department, you have a research and development department, and you have a web design department. In order to maximize and optimize your company's performance, what psychologists would say, who follow a self-determination theory, they would say that in order to maximize intrinsic motivation in a place where people are paid to work, so that would suggest that because people are being paid, that maybe extrinsic motivation would take over more than intrinsic motivation. In order to maximize intrinsic motivation, you want your employees to feel autonomous in their work, not micromanaged by those who are above them. You want them to feel competent about their abilities, and you want them to feel a sense of security and companionship with those that they interact with on a daily basis. And so autonomy and competence in particular go together really well. Everyone wants to be autonomous, but in order for you to be autonomous, you have to actually know what you're doing. So that requires a competence. And for you as a CEO, you can stop micromanaging people when people feel confident about their own abilities and feel that they can work independently and can figure out any problems they might have on their own. And so in self-determination theory, motivation, as we mentioned earlier, is considered to follow a spectrum. So there's basically three levels. On one side, there's amotivation. Then in the middle, there's extrinsic motivation. And on the right-hand side, the highest level, there's intrinsic motivation. So when you hire someone who did not previously have a job, and you offer to pay them for doing a job, you are moving them from amotivation to extrinsic motivation. They now have some external factor, money, that is motivating them to do that job. And then as they continue to go through your company, what you want is for them to move from extrinsic motivation to intrinsic motivation. So by helping your employees feel autonomous, competent, and having them experience high relatedness in their workplace, that will help move them from a place of extrinsic motivation to a place of intrinsic motivation. And so it's most people's goals that they will be able to find a job that pays well, but also a job that they naturally enjoy. And according to self-determination theory, those three elements have to be in place in order for that to happen.